Good morning, everybody, and thank you for watching. The storm system that we've been talking about the last 24, 48, 72 hours now with all the different implications, particularly the wind threat, it's exiting the continental U.S. You can see that if you look toward the east. We're looking at an infrared satellite imagery of the U.S. here, valid as of this morning on Thursday, March 6th. Now, actual low pressure system itself, you can see one of those kind of central areas of the low here off the coast of the Carolinas, this cloud shield kind of pushing up into New England, some lingering showers there. But largely the kind of impacts of this waning now will put kind of a bookend on this one. And we got to do that quickly, because if you look toward the western U.S., we have another one of these systems coming in. And it's just it's a cycle, and it feels like it begins anew. But that's a hint in and of itself that this pattern that we're in is progressive, that we're going to have more systems to talk about. In fact, to kind of get into the later portions of the video, not only do we have this other system that's coming on shore here, that you can see that cloud shield extending over the southwest and portions of the Colorado Basin, likely looking at another weak system just behind that, likely to impact portions of California going through early next work week, and then ultimately yet another system behind that, which is looking even more potent, maybe something even akin to what we just saw come through this work week. Now, that's getting, it's Thursday today, you're talking maybe 7-8 days out. The details on that aren't clear. We're going to dive into some of that here today. But we want you to know as the system and this pattern is moving, and there's going to be more to talk about as we kind of go 2, 3, and these 4-day cycles here. Now, I mentioned I do want to put a bookend on this system to get into some of those next ones that we're talking about. I will take you back to yesterday morning, show you the change in power outages. This is, if you go to poweroutage.us, kind of underline the URL there so you can get there yourself. This was valid as of yesterday. I took the screen grab showing nearly 200,000 Americans without power. And we saw some severe storms move through Louisiana, Mississippi, saw a number of wind reports, a few scattered tornado reports, saw some of that severe activity push into parts of the Carolinas and the mid-Atlantic yesterday with some wind threats associated. But the vast majority of the power outages that you can see here were non-severe winds, just gradient winds around the storm. This was an impressive wind event that came through much of the central and eastern U.S., Texas perhaps hardest hit. There's wildfire risk associated with this. But impressively, those crews have been hard at work overnight in some pretty brutal conditions. And if you look at the power outage map valid here as of this morning, just kind of zoom in a bit here, massive improvement. Yesterday maybe around 200,000 outages at this time, and we're down to maybe 20 to 30,000. So impressive improvement in just the last day or so. Now, beyond the wind, we saw snowfall, blizzard warnings and conditions in parts of western Iowa, eastern Nebraska, northeast Kansas near the Missouri River, and saw some harrowing conditions. Western Iowa essentially shut down with pileups on the interstate. Saw a number of damage photos, just gas station coverings. They're blown off of them, 60-mile-an-hour plus winds. And then you talk about the cold temperatures associated with that, the blowing snow and whiteout conditions, just very rough in portions of the Central Plains over the last 48 hours. Now, a significant component of this last system that comes through, we have to talk about the precipitation, which areas saw it and which areas didn't. If you kind of draw a line near the 100th meridian and go east, a lot of these areas are over an inch of rain. We talk about Minneapolis toward the southeast. Now, if we get picky here and scrutinize some of these areas that were over an inch, you can see portions of the central Corn Belt here, portions of the southeast stretching over toward the Carolinas, but there are some holes in here. There always are. Portions of south central Indiana, or I should say Illinois, stretching into Indiana, portions of the Ohio River Valley, and then Florida, which has seen drought build in over the last few weeks, lingering through the winter here, also missing out on some of this appreciable precipitation. So this kind of Florida, Carolinas drought is something we'll have to keep an eye on. Portions of the Ohio River Valley here, we talked about those holes, but really a good shot of rain for a number of areas here. Not all of these needing more precipitation this week, but some of them certainly will take it. Portions of the Corn Belt in the upper Midwest were drying out, and that story kind of became more clear over the last 2 weeks. And if we look at the NASA estimated root zone soil moistures, and this is valid as of this morning here, March 6th, really significant improvement just with that inch plus of rain here over some of these areas. I mean, this was an area that was getting pretty dry, and save for some of those holes that we just mentioned here, south central Illinois stretching over toward Indiana, maybe Kokomo area, a lot of nice improvements here from an area that we were getting a little bit more concerned with for drought. Now, if we turn that conversation, we shift toward the southeast. We did see some precipitation come into here. It wasn't enough to bust the drought that has built into the southeast. We've seen wildfire issues in the Carolinas, even stretching over toward New Jersey. This is something I think we're going to have to continue to watch as we go through kind of the spring forecast. This is an area that responds quicker to drought than maybe some other areas of the country where we're typically talking about drought as more of a central part of the conversation. You're going to dry out much quicker in an area like Florida that's used to receiving much more precipitation regularly than you'll see in other areas of the country, which is why wildfire concerns have popped up quickly there. And that doesn't change. We'll look at some of those in the forecast as well that remain a concern. In fact, nice segue here as we jump over and look at the all hazards map valid as of this morning. Just updated this as about 6 a.m. Central Time, 7 a.m. Eastern, and kind of right on time. Red flag warnings now valid for portions of the central and eastern coast of Florida here. You can see additional red flag warnings over toward New Mexico and the panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma. That is in response to yet this next system. We can even see winter storm warnings up through parts of Nebraska and Wyoming associated with that. Some winter storm warnings over the Colorado Basin as well. This is an area that could use more snowpack. So seeing these warnings out here today, I think are good news for some of those areas. Now I want to jump over and show you the precipitation animation as this morning. This is the radar over the southwestern U.S. Can see some lingering showers over portions of Central California, Fresno toward Bakersfield, some of those coming along the coastline here, South Central California. Some of this precipitation now turning to snow as it comes up the higher elevation of the Colorado Basin here, portions of northern and eastern Arizona. Some of this falling as rainfall further to the south of there. But you can see why. We can see those winter storm warnings. If you notice that stretch of them, it was pushing out into the central plains. Can see some of the snow now consolidating over portions of Wyoming, Nebraska, even western Kansas here this morning. Now, I want to zoom in here. This is looking at the 3-kilometer NAM, get a sense for how this next system is going to wrap up behind the current one that we're talking about. Make this valid. Let's do it 7 a.m. Central Time. You can see those lingering showers that we talked about over portions of New England and just some light snow on the backside of the system coming through here. Much of this not even really kind of getting to the ground at this point over portions of the Appalachians. But if we look toward the west, that next system is really kind of already on shore here this morning. I'm going to take this forecast out. You're going to see this wrap up in portions of Wyoming, again, portions of northern Nebraska, southern South Dakota. This is tonight after sunset Thursday. Take it into Friday morning. You can see that snow shifting east over Iowa, portions of northern Illinois, maybe far northwest Indiana. That rain snow line probably hugging I-80 as it often does this time of year with these systems. It feels like we're now into Friday afternoon. And that system kind of weakening. It's just some rain showers exiting east along the Ohio River Valley. Not a significant amount of precipitation coming from this system. Can see some lingering showers across portions of Texas and the southeast as well, the southern Mississippi River Valley. That likely extending through the day. On Saturday, could see some severe weather. Try to consolidate along this low that's now formed over eastern Texas, kind of this Texarkana area. Right now, the SPC, I believe they're around a marginal risk. So low severe chances, but perhaps some thunderstorms, something to keep an eye on this area as we get into the weekend. We saw those red flag warnings. No surprise to see from the Storm Prediction Center, their fire weather risk is at that critical level here in eastern New Mexico, western Texas. So continuation, unfortunately, of the fire weather that we were talking about earlier this week with another system coming in. Now, the good news is this comparatively weaker system comes through. I won't even dive too much into these, but the day one outlook, that is Thursday, Friday, no risk area really to talk about. And then that marginal risk in the southern Mississippi River Valley, that getting out into Saturday. Could see, an area that would shock me if we get a little bit more focused area here in portions of Louisiana to keep an eye on, but not going to be the same level of risk that we saw with this latest system that came through. All right, I already kind of mentioned or kind of floated this idea of this progressive system. I think you can see it here just as of Thursday morning in that trough ridge pattern. This is the forecast from ECMWF. We'll take this out over the next week or so to get a sense for how many of those systems are coming through and which are going to be the strongest. So first up, here's the one exiting our area now. This is the system that's coming in this morning that we just talked about. We'll see that stretch across parts of Texas. And you can see how already it's a bit on the weaker side. This is now Sunday, March 9th, just as we kind of turn the calendar day toward that. Now that pushes through the southeast. Again, a weaker system here, a ridge behind that with some warm temperatures. Really going to feel the warm up late weekend and then early next week as a weaker system comes here onshore in California on Monday, bringing some precipitation to Southern California, the San Diego area, up toward the Los Angeles area, maybe even the Central Valley, and then areas in Arizona as well as that comes through. But again, on the weaker side early in the week here as this exits east of the divide. But you can see that trough I mentioned potentially coming out of the Gulf of Alaska. This one compared to the last two that we just talked about coming on shore, a lot more potent. So as that makes its way over the western U.S., the implications of this are going to be more significant in terms of precipitation, snowfall out west, potentially a wind event, portions of the Pacific Northwest, and then tapping into much more Gulf moisture as it ejects off the continental divide, potentially bringing together a severe threat, over areas of the southern U.S., perhaps the Mississippi River Valley, maybe even pushing up into the Midwest, as that makes its way in late next week. We're now into a 7-day forecast. This is valid as of Friday p.m. So that severe threat that I mentioned, if anything, could be coming together Friday p.m. We're well out beyond 7 days at this point. So the details of it we can't get too clear on. But what the models are agreeing on, the GFS and some others, is that this trough is going to be the most potent one of the next three that we're going to talk about. Now, I alluded to that temperature conversation a bit. Frankly, I usually get to temperature a little bit later, but wanted to cover it early because, as you can imagine, with these systems, one quickly exiting on the backside, we get some colder air coming through. We saw that with that freeze warning over Georgia, valid as of this morning. We'll warm up behind that, and then, again, we'll be on this roller coaster of temperature swings. So this morning, if we look at the National Weather Service high temperature forecast across the continental U.S., colder on the backside of the system that's coming through here this morning, kind of exiting the area that we're talking about. A little bit of a warm up behind that because here's that next system that's coming in, and I'll make that color a little bit more obvious here. So that warm up ahead of that system, let's talk about the red flag warnings, parts of New Mexico, colder behind that one. And I'll just play this forward as we go into Friday. See that system out west now pushing toward the east. You start kind of dig into Texas here. So behind that, cooling off, warming up over portions of the southeast. We see temperatures warming up over the plains on Saturday. That increases on Sunday the 9th, and then the 10th with that ridging building in across the central part of the country. Likely to be a very nice end of the weekend and then start to the early next week. I talked about on Monday how another system's coming into portions of Southern California, perhaps Central California as well, bringing precipitation to this area here, including Arizona. Temperatures falling on the backside of that system on Tuesday. Going to be kind of more of a wet, raw day here in portions of the Southwest. And then Wednesday, still cooler. With that next system coming in, we talked about Thursday, Friday, temperatures likely warming up pretty significantly in advance of that. This only goes out toward Wednesday, March 12th, but the 13th and 14th, as that system comes in, likely to see these high temperatures linger over the central part of the country here. Temperatures, again, pushing up towards 70 Fahrenheit. Unfortunately, as we get later in the week, that's going to be overtaken by clouds and precipitation. It'll be nice. Enjoy it while you can. GFS here is pretty consistent. We talked about some differences, yesterday and the day before, but at least with these first 2 week systems, I'll take this quickly. Monday, March 10th, there's that one we were talking about in the southwestern U.S. That next system, again, it looks potent. This one digging a little bit earlier than the ECMWF, and what that does, it kind of cuts it off from the main flow. So the GFS compared to the ECMWF, we're all the way out now Friday, March 14th into the afternoon. We mentioned that's likely when this is going to eject off the continental divide, likely bringing that severe thunderstorm, likely bringing that precipitation threat, perhaps some snow on the backside of this. With the GFS a little bit more cut off here, perhaps less potent than the ECMWF. Without that kind of ability to quickly amplify and rejoin that jet stream level flow, you can almost see it weaken pretty quickly as we go Friday, Saturday, Sunday there, before eventually kind of getting absorbed back up toward New England. The ECMWF, in comparison to that, here's Thursday, March 13th. You can see it kind of rejoin the flow here, but it amplifies a little bit more. So perhaps some more precipitation and a more consolidated severe threat as that comes through right now. But again, we're talking 8 days out. It's hard to get too nitpicky in some of these differences here. Let's see if we can zoom in here on some of the differences in precipitation. I'll take this quickly. What you're looking at on the right is the European model forecast. On the left is the GFS. I've already taken it out toward Friday morning here. The reason I did that quickly is, right, they're pretty similar up to that point. Portions of Arizona looking at precipitation here Friday with that next system coming through. Current one, you see that stretch of narrow band of snowfall, kind of along I-80. We see that consistent between the two models here with that rain snow line, again, kind of south of I-80. Next system that comes through, again, we talked about that brief severe threat that we might see on Saturday, more so just rain and precipitation across the southern Mississippi Valley. So that stretches east through portions of Georgia and the Carolinas. Unfortunately, some differences in terms of that Florida drought that we just talked about. The ECMWF trying to bring precipitation into there as we get into Monday. GFS kind of hops over it a little bit quickly, so we'll have to watch that as we get in through the early next week. There's that weak system, pretty decent similarities here. Looking at California and Arizona, again, from the ECMWF on the right and the GFS on the left. Here comes that next system behind that, fairly consistent. California looking at a very wet middle week next week, Wednesday. Very heavy snowfall, multiple feet in the Sierra Nevada. Cascades looking at precipitation and snowfall as well, the Willamette Valley. And if you look here, this is a pretty compact, potent low, so could be seeing a wind threat along portions of the coastal mountains here, maybe even a little bit further inland in some of the metro area there. We'll have to keep an eye on that as the system wraps up on Wednesday night next week. That trough makes its way along the Colorado Basin here, bringing more precipitation, more snowfall here. I'm going to put a pin in that. More snowfall over the Colorado Basin. We're going to talk about that at the end of the video quickly. And quickly, I'll take this back a little bit here. If you look on Wednesday of next week, you can see this brief rainmaker that both models have picked up on now, moving through portions of the Mid-South. ECMWF actually brings more of that precipitation into the Corn Belt. We're talking Wednesday and Thursday of next week. The GFS comparatively keeps more of that precipitation toward the southeast. That's going to be a quick rain event, but not insignificant with some of the totals there. We'll have to keep an eye on that. And then eventually consolidating that next big low pressure system, that next potent system that we'll have to talk about all the way out near Friday evening. Right, all the way next week, the 14th and the 15th, the middle of March here. And if you look at the ECMWF, it's a little bit more amplified toward the north. You can see that precipitation shield pushing further up into Canada. And there might be more organization in that severe weather threat. We'll have to see. Again, I don't want to get too much into the details given how far out it is, but these systems right now are not identical on the GFS and ECMWF, and it's going to be a story through the weekend and early week to seeing how they diverge, both on that kind of midweek precipitation that we just talked about and how they amplify on Friday. Now, if we kind of simplify this and just look at the two different precipitation totals, we'll take this through Saturday, March 15th. See the ECMWF putting down near an inch of rain for a large swath of the middle part of the country, more than that in the portions of the southeast. This is the total precipitation over the next 10 days. If we compare that quickly to the GFS, just kind of visually, again, the ECMWF with that more consolidated, amplified trough pattern, more precipitation over the next 10 days compared to the GFS. Again, something to keep in mind. This area here where the ECMWF has been a little bit more biased toward that wet signal is a portion of the country we've talked about a lot this winter. So we've shifted towards spring where we have built in this snow drought. And this has been reflected even in the drought monitor change map. If we just look over the last 8 weeks, some portions of the upper Midwest, we talked about the central Corn Belt, just on the dry trend over the last 8 weeks. So bringing in another round of precipitation here, I think is good news as we shift toward that planning conversation, as long as we get those windows opening up at the end of March and then into April. Another way to simplify it and looking at that precipitation story over the next 10 days, this is the ECMWF precipitation anomalies. Kind of big story here is how wet we are out west, the Colorado Basin, California, San Diego, but in the mountains there in Southern California. I mean, that's an area that we were talking about drought not too long ago. We were talking about the Santa Ana winds and the fire threat associated with what was essentially perhaps their top two, maybe their driest start to their water year on record. When that happens, you start talking about the hope for a miracle March. And that hope looks to have come to fruition here with California painted in the green here from the ECMWF. I think there's perhaps more chances getting out through the end of March for another round of precipitation in parts of the west. So the good news is California, in terms of their snowpack, the water situation, even through Southern California, an area that missed out on a lot of the rain events even earlier in the year, trying to make up for that a bit at the end of the year here. The miracle March seems to be coming in. Kind of zoom in on that, precipitation values across the western U.S. over the next kind of 7 to 10 days are going to be impressive, certainly for Southern California, but even the Sierra Nevada looking at another bountiful shot of snow over the next week or so. Portions of the coastline, I mean, there's really few areas here of California that miss out on this. And even portions of the desert southwest Arizona looking at an inch plus of precipitation. That extends down south of the rim and even into the lower Colorado River Valley, where I can't rule out a decent amount of precipitation falling on some of these areas. And a half an inch there, you're talking pretty significant in terms of their annual total. To kind of put this in perspective, we just look at Escondido, kind of an area near San Diego, a little bit further inland. See, very dry start to their water year. In fact, the end of 2024 for them is here in this gray dotted line. I know it's kind of hard to see. Try to zoom in on that a little bit here to make this more obvious, but this dotted line was last year. See, all their precipitation came early in the year, and then they were on this flat line all the way through the end of the year that continued into January of this year. But now looking at 3 to 4 inches of rain over the next week, so they're going to jump all the way up to average, maybe even above that. And we can see that western precipitation story reflected in the Climate Prediction Center, their 6 to 10 day precipitation outlook. And then with that system wrapping up next week, again, kind of highlighting that swath of 1 inch plus of rainfall that we talked about. Areas that potentially missing out. Again, we talked about Florida and the Southern Plains, and that kind of sets us up for that seasonal conversation that Eric talked about yesterday. We'll talk about that just at the end of this video. Look at the snowfall forecast again. Mentioned going to be bountiful across portions of Sierra Nevada, even up into portions of the Cascades here. Intermountain areas looking healthy as well, with Colorado Basin snowfall chances as well over the next 7 days. The Columbia Basin as well, further to the north. Another conversation Eric touched on quickly yesterday was the sudden stratospheric warming. This is looking at far up into the stratosphere over the North Pole. And really the forecast that he dove into yesterday, the data is pretty similar here this morning, where we're going to see one of these events where these warming events are actually this drop in the forecast on this graph of these winds over the poles. When we see these in winter, particularly kind of December, January, February, we start talking about these potential cold air outbreaks. For whatever reason in March, at least with this system here, not seeing that same level of concern for a cold air outbreak. In fact, as he was showing this yesterday, and I was kind of looking at it and zooming in, this blue line that you can see on here is actually last winter, so 23 to 24. The red line has been this winter, 24 to 25. The orange is the forecast out through the middle of March. And coincidentally, we had a nearly identical warming event in March of last year and spring of 24. And that kind of begs the question, well, what happened last year with this big event that came through? And as I kind of scrutinized temperature anomalies in mid-March of last year, kind of the same time period that this event is happening, well, if I take it through March 9th, which would be this weekend out through the 25th of March from last year, we were warm for much of the country during that stretch. Not crazy warm, but certainly not on the cold side. If anything, kind of ending up as a kind of a warmer March. I went looking for a large cold air outbreak in different parts of March last year. I really could not find it. If you look to near the end of March or even into early April, we started to cool off a bit in the western U.S., perhaps southwestern portions of the United States. That perhaps lines up a little bit with the forecast here. This isn't a massive cold air outbreak, just a bit on the cooler side with all the precipitation that we're talking about there. And it does kind of line up with the forecast, but not seeing one of these massive cold air outbreaks. If we just kind of peruse the Climate Prediction Center, their temperature outlook through the middle, even getting toward the end of March. Again, wet in the west, cooler in the west, perhaps lining up with last year a little bit, but not seeing one of these huge outbreaks into portions of the central U.S. So not too concerned about that right now. Always love jumping over and looking at the grid of forecasted temperatures. Top line here, we're looking 0 to 5 day temperatures. So this kind of weekend into early next week. Looking out into the next work week here from the ECMWF ensemble, very warm across the Midwest and Eastern U.S., out ahead of that powerful trough that we just talked about, consistent in virtually all the global models here, the GEFS and then the AFS from the ECMWF. If we stretch this out even further, 10 to 15 day anomalies, that takes us through the middle of March. Warm here from the ECMWF, on the warmer side from the GFS, the AFS going a little bit cooler in portions of the central U.S., but again, not seeing a huge cold air outbreak here, just a moderation in temperatures. If we get the extended forecast from the ECMWF, this came out yesterday. It's kind of a similar pattern, and this is similar to what we just talked about even in the near-term forecast. This forecast takes us from March 12th to April 12th, so a 30-day forecast kind of getting us through the end of March into early April. And we've seen this consistent pattern. We've talked about it quite a bit this year, and that's wet here in the forecasts in the west. We just talked about that in the near term. Drier over the Texas. You just remember we looked at that ECMWF precipitation total. See if I can find that quickly. And again, we kind of see a similar pattern here where we're dry in the southern plains, some dryness concerns in Florida. Outside of that, looking a bit on the wetter side. If I come back here, it's really kind of watching the drought here over the southern plains, keeping an eye on a drought here, portions of South Dakota and Nebraska, and seeing how these develop as we get into the new growing season here. Now, we talked about this yesterday, the new ECMWF forecast. Zoom this in to make it a little bigger here. The March, April, May forecast from the ECMWF highlights kind of both those areas of dryness that we were worried about, the southern plains potentially expanding toward the central plains, portions of the high plains here, Kansas, Nebraska, and then portions of the southeast here. Again, the drought here tends to have more impacts quicker than areas further to the west. So those wildfire concerns will pick up here quicker than some other areas. The impacts will be felt more acutely. But nonetheless, still watching for this concern here, March, April, May. As I take this forecast into April, May, and June, you can see that precipitation starting to return to the southeast. I mean, if anywhere in the country can develop drought issues quickly, but remove them quickly, it's the southeast. If you bring that thunderstorm regime back there as we get into the warmer months here in the convective season, it's going to erase that drought quickly in the southeast. May, June, and July now getting out toward into the growing season proper, and you can see, unfortunately, the ECMWF hanging on to that drought and pushing it into portions of the northern plains, the upper Midwest, and even portions of the Corn Belt here across Iowa, eastern Nebraska, eastern Kansas, portions of South Dakota, and North Dakota. Again, it's too early to say definitively, here we go, this is a big drought year. It's a concern that's on the table. We talked about that snow drought that we're watching. With all that being said, kind of two things to walk back some of the concern here, at least things that I'm watching. One, if I take you all the way back to the beginning of the video, just something to catch my eye here. See if I can pull up the jet stream level winds here. Just valid as of this morning. The MJO has been lingering here in the Western Hemisphere, kind of in the Central Pacific, and then making it shift across the Western Hemisphere. When it does that, we typically see an uptick in the subtropical jet, and that is what we can see right here, stretching from Hawaii over toward the West Coast. In fact, that's allowed some of these systems to actually wrap up a little bit more and bring some precipitation back to the plains. Not a significant amount, it hasn't been drought busting, but at least it's been some measurable precip in portions of Nebraska, Kansas, and some of these other areas. If this lingers around, the MJO has already shown propensity just here in March to kind of linger in this area, and this subtropical jet stream sticks around, it's going to at least keep chances of the precipitation in some of these drier areas where we're concerned about drought. Chances lingering are there to talk about over the next week or so, and you get enough of those in and we start removing some of that drought concern. Perhaps another piece to that is this kind of spring uncertainty window, or we'd call it different times, the spring transition, or as we get into more of the kind of convective season, as we get into April and May, these forecasts shift around. It's just the reality of seasonal forecasting. So as much as the concern is there here in March, there are other things we'll have to talk about, the kind of progress of La Nina weakening, the El Nino. Eric mentioned yesterday it's too early to start talking about El Nino, but if we get into April and May and that rears its head in a big way and we see those winds shift around in the Pacific, perhaps that drought concern gets lessened. So some more things to talk about. We'll be on it for you all. Eric will be back with you all tomorrow on Friday. And as far as this Thursday morning goes, thank you for listening.